Thank you for coming, everyone. This is Carrying the Torch, Grief and Remembrance in Open Source with Hazel Weakly.
Thank you. So I was actually very interested to see how many people were going to show up. I know Mad Dog is way over in the different room, and that probably has the whole rest of the conference in there. But I am glad that other people showed up. This will be awesome. This will be super fun. Well, actually, it won't be fun, but it'll be interesting. So, grief and remembrance in open source. This is a topic that is very dear to my heart because it's something that I have personally gone through. It's something that I've had to struggle with, and it's something that a lot of other people that I know have had to struggle with too. And it turns out that we are not really good at understanding grief as a society, grief as a culture, and we struggle with projects and software and figuring out how to do them collaboratively, much less when the collaboration breaks apart a little bit. And so one thing that I started to do is I tried to take my journey that I went through and piece it together and figure out how do I explain this to other people. And when I was trying to figure out how to explain to other people, I struggled with it a little bit and realized that I had to sort of start from memory. So we think of remembrance. Remembrance is a little easier to deal with than grief, so it's easier to kind of start there. And so with remembrance, one of the things that you have to think of is we have individuals and then we have collectives. And the individuals and collectives, it turns out, are really hard to differentiate and separate sometimes. They end up being two sides of the same coin. With individuals, we have anchors, I think, artifacts, and connection. So when I think of this, for individuals, for memory, how do we actually remember? How do our brains form connection? How do our brains do this? So psychologically, neurologically, humans form memories through a couple different mechanisms. You essentially have this anchor, and the anchor is how you recall the information. When you have that information, you then connect it to something else. And the tangible sort of thing that you connect it to ends up being kind of this artifact. We like to build artifacts, we like to build things, shiny, super great, super awesome. And it's this web of artifacts connected and anchored that lets us find things in our brain and remember them and think about that. For collective memory, for groups, you have the same exact concepts, just slightly differently. So for groups, you have culture. Culture becomes the anchor. Culture becomes the thing that lets you have that sort of grounding location and point. And then rather than having necessarily individual artifacts, you have process. Process is really important because process is the thing that we learn rather than the tool that we build or the thing that we have. In a collective, the thing that you share is not the outcome, it's the process of getting to the outcome. Which also means, but you tie them together the same way with connection. So connection is, at that point I realized, connection is really the thing that takes the collective group and the individual and blends them together. It's this concept of connection that makes it so hard to differentiate between the individual and the group. And if you think of the strongest anchor humans have, it is the sense of identity. It's their sense of this belonging as part of that identity, this groupness, this belonging, all these things. That is the most central, the strongest root. It grounds you in who you are as a person. And it's one of the reasons why growing up without a sense of identity is so deeply traumatizing. But if you lose your sense of identity, it is more deeply traumatizing than essentially any other form. And it's also one of the reasons why one of the most inhuman forms of treatment for humans is isolation, because it disconnects us from anything that forms our identity, from anything that gives us that ability to have connection and meaning, and we lose all sense of an ability to find meaning. And so I thought about this connection, this identity, and what happens when the things that you are connected to become severed when you lose them, or when you lose a person, or maybe not even a person. Broken processes, broken connections in general, you have to process them with grief. Grief is the body and the mind's way of taking a connection that used to be there and rebuilding it. Much like you have bones, when the bones break, your body goes through this mending process. When the bone is healed, it's not the same anymore. You can tell that it healed, but the mending process has to happen. And grief is the mind's way and the collective culture's way of processing and mending the broken connection that happened and figuring out how to actually deal with it. It doesn't have to be death, or it doesn't have to be loss. Grief comes in many, many forms. It can also not even necessarily be something you might even call grief. I can remember back when I was a kid downloading video games over T1 connection. At 98%, the connection severs and I lose the whole thing. I have to start over. You go through the whole 5 stages of grief right there and then. So grief doesn't have to be necessarily deeply tragic and traumatic. But the connection gets severed, your brain has to heal from it, you have to reconcile with it and be okay and move forward. And that is grief. But it means that also, so before we dive too deep in on breakage and how to heal from the breakage, it is, I think, a bit easier to figure out how we got there. And to figure out how to build the connections and build the relationships and what that really means. Because then we're going to have to do that anyway, to heal with the grief. So that's when I got through that journey of trying to understand how to explain what I got through and how to teach people to heal their communities. I kind of had to, this was the next step. Figuring out, okay, well, how did these communities form? How did they build in the first place? So first, before we actually really get into grief, we should talk about the formation. So a person builds tools in order to care for themselves. Community builds a process in order to care for each other. So humans, when we actually go through life, we find a problem, we find something, and we address that problem by building a tool. The process of tool building is essentially how we function in society, how we do all of our adaptation, because otherwise we are floppy little meat skeleton things that aren't really good for a whole lot of stuff, other than building tools to help us be, less terrible at other stuff. But with the culture group, with the community, if you build a tool for communities, cool, now what? It turns out that now what is sort of, you just draw a blank. You can't really figure it out. And what's the difference between a garage of crap and a makerspace? Which is also a garage of crap, but with really, really cool culture built into it. They have this culture of sharing, this process of how do you bring more crap into the makerspace? How do you get rid of some other stuff? And oh wow, that's been there since longer than you were alive, and man, that makes me feel old. And you have this evolution of the makerspace, and it becomes fundamentally different than the tools, and the tools are not really the point of the space. It turns out they are useful. The individuals in the space will build and make and use and share the tools, but it is the process through which they do it that helps them care for each other. So thinking of this process of mutual, of collective care. Software development actually had a very interesting origin. When we were figuring software development out, professional programming was not a thing for quite a while until quite a while after software development really became something that you could figure out, something you could do. It was essentially for, academia, for hobbyists, for messing around, fucking around, and finding out. It was fantastic. But what would happen is you would have this sort of a library area, and you would write some code, you'd solve a problem for you, you'd take this code, you'd put it in the library, you'd register it, someone else might peruse the library and find it and download it and run it. And if they liked it, they might modify it. And if they modified it, maybe at some point you'd find yourself at a conference with them, and then they'd walk up to you and go, "Hey, I really liked that thing that you built. I used it for this and that. And oh, by the way, I added a flag to it that does some stuff. You want to see what I did?" And then they started talking, and they said, "Oh, can you email me a patch for that?" And they're like, "What's email?" They're just kidding. They did figure out email, but here's a patch. Okay, cool, awesome. And one thing that's important with that is, if you think of all these roles people play in a community, even if the community is just 2 people, all the roles people play in a community of building the community, contributing to it, caring for it, sharing it, all these different roles. One thing that was fascinating about the early historic process of software development, you just kind of did all the roles, and everybody did all the roles. And so collective ownership, collective caretaking, collective sharing, collective community building was the intuitive thing that humans already were biologically wired to do, carried over. All the intuitions of what happens if this person leaves the project. What happens? Well, we know them. We know their address. We know all these other people. And this person knows that this other person, the social fabric, is so deeply intertwined that it's almost like a community garden. Well, if one person stops showing up to the community garden, the other gardeners figure it out. You don't need to teach them how to do that. It was inherent in the process of building the garden. And also, like if you have an unofficial family member that you adopt, and they come over, and then they stop coming over, and you check up on them. And all these human interactions are built into, we already know how to do it. But something changed with software development. We figured out how to make money on it a little bit. We figured out how to hire people. People became professional developers, and slowly but surely the complexity, the size of the community got to a point in which everybody fulfilling every role in the community wasn't really feasible anymore. It just didn't happen. And granted, that's not how it happens in human societies and human scale for larger communities anyway. It really only does work up to about 20 to 50 people. And then, roles get a bit specialized. But usually that group grows to a certain size, and the group figures out how to take care of it by the time they get there. With software development, that happened almost instantaneously. And even if it didn't happen instantaneously, the size grew so rapidly that even if one small project or one small community figured this collective ownership out, by the time they could teach other people, other groups, how to figure it out, there were a million other groups. There were a million new people. There were a million new projects. Things were expanding so rapidly that collectively we lost the knowledge of how to take care of software and of each other. And one of the difficult things of that is it's not necessarily a bad thing to lose a skill set in one area, or to change the dynamics such that something that was implicit now has to be explicit. We used to, back in the day, when cars were just becoming a thing, you didn't need traffic lights. Vehicles or buggies, horse buggies, they weren't going super fast. A constable or a traffic officer in the middle of the square directing people was completely sufficient. It's not a bad thing to need explicit process sometimes. It does help things scale, it does help things be better. But we didn't keep track of all the different things of making a community, growing the community, growing and building this ability to interact together. We didn't really learn how to do that super well and make that tacit knowledge explicit. And so when we needed to now take this implicit process and make an explicit one, we didn't really know how to do that. And we just never learned. But it means that when these connections between people, when these connections between processes, between projects, between the different things that tie our fabric together, when those connections get broken, you need to relearn how to grieve and relearn how to heal that broken connection. Because we never learned how to form that connection. And so now we need to relearn what it means in this type of society to have that type of shared understanding, that shared learning, that shared community. It's like back when communal living used to be the norm. We figured out a whole bunch of things on how to do communal living. And then the atomic family unit became a thing. And when the atomic family unit became a thing, childcare became something that was really, really hard because the elderly generation were not just sort of already there. Multi-generational housing became single-generational housing, and we needed an entire cottage industry of pop-up sub-industries to support a new social structure and way of working. But also, we needed to find a new way to relearn how to grieve. And so in Western societies, our grief process looks really, really different compared to what it used to even a couple hundred years ago. We actually have to relearn what it means for our severed connections to heal, and software is going to have to do the same thing. So when I looked through this, and I was also going through my grief process, I was like, well, what does grief look like? And because I'm a huge nerd, I always want to know, like the science of something or the theory behind something. Can I look at the shape of it and kind of pull it apart and figure some of these things out? And so with grief, the shape of grief, it's very culturally dependent, it's very contextual, it's very individual, but there are some similarities, and the similarities are fascinating. So one of the biggest similarities is that grief tends to be collective. The whole idea, the whole notion of the individual grieving silently is a made-up fabric of capitalism. Was not necessary. Pretty much every culture on the planet doesn't do that. The hyper-individualistic society took collective grief and said, that doesn't exist. That requires us to care for each other, and that doesn't make money. One of the other things of grief is almost every culture in the world has an understanding that grief takes multiple years before you're at full function. You might be okay, as in you're showing up to work, but full function as a human, you able to go through all the processes of life, that takes multiple years to at least. And we've been able to back this up and show it with psychology. It really does take 2 years, at least. And culturally, that's varies super widely. So some cultures and areas around in the Egypt area, grieving for 7 years or a decade or more, super normal, super common. Western societies, you can get a medical diagnosis of severe grief disorder if you grieve for more than 1 year. Now, that is America. We have in the DSM a severe grief disorder, and the severe grief disorder is something that you need to cure. And you can cure it with medication. and a couple other processes in certain type of therapy if your grief process takes more than a year. Even though, biologically, neurologically, we know the grief takes at least 2 years for full function. However, pills. Anyway, one of the other things that we have started to discover, which a lot of cultures knew, but the Western societies have had to relearn, is there's no recovery. There's no things getting back to normal. There's no, and then I'm fine. It's you rebuild the neural pathways in your brain. You rebuild something into a completely different shape. You are now a new person. We also, when we finally started studying trauma, instead of, minimizing and re-traumatizing people, we said, oh, they are actually fundamentally different people after this. And grief is the same way. It is a type of trauma, it's a type of healing process, and afterwards, you are a different person. And everyone that you interact with will perceive you as a different person. And if you collectively grieve, that means that your community is now a fundamentally different community, a fundamentally different shape. And if you're not aware of that, and if you think, oh, but then we get back to normal, you're going to be very disappointed when normal isn't the same. You might get back to full function, but it won't necessarily be what you call normal in the context of you from several years ago. And it won't be the same. It will never be, and that's okay. One other thing that I saw that was actually, it made a lot of sense to me because this was how I was able to get back to full functioning and get back to something that resembled okay. This is the concept of continuing bonds. And a lot of cultures have continuing bonds. They call it different things. They have different rituals for it, different religious elements for it, depending on the culture. But continuing bond, it turns out human connections are almost never truly separated. They're never truly severed, even if the person isn't around. You are still connected to them in some way. So rather than rejecting that, or thinking, that's not how this works, or I can't be connected with them because they're gone, or missing, or dead, or they hate me, you will always be connected to them in some way. And that's a fundamental element of the healing process of grief, is learning how to reshape the connection rather than rewire without it. The connection changes shape, but it is still there. And part of that rewiring is the rituals of transition. So that is, how do you go through these steps and sort of give yourself the ceremony to allow yourself to move into the next stage of your healing journey. And these rituals, it turns out, are actually really, really helpful, even if the mechanical movement of it doesn't, seem necessary. Having a ritual, drawing a little box, putting the thing in the box, putting a little bow on it, and then going, this is my grief bow, really, really helps. Your brain really needs that. And pretending otherwise is doing yourself and your community a huge disservice. And so if you think of, and so when I thought of these rituals, these continuing connection, all these other things, it really helped me understand that, well, we have this other element of grief that's very, very interesting. It's intersubjective. It's shared across many people. But it means that it is also, particularly with the connecting bond, that connecting bond, those rituals that help you build that bond, is central to your ability to construct meaning out of what happened. If you do not find a way to construct a coherent narrative and meaning out of the experiences that your collective community has gone through, the community will become incoherent, and the dissonance of that incoherence will blow it apart. what will blow you apart? And so, meaning then is collectively built. And this was one of the things that I kind of intuitively knew, but sort of finding like some of the research about it, finding some of the ways to think about it was really transformative for me. It was really helpful. And so when we think about the meaning being collectively built, it means you all have to do it together. You need that culture, you need that process, you need the rituals of transition to figure out how things work for you. And it mirrored so strongly what I went through with Hachyderm and with some of the other elements of loss that we had when I lost my dear friend Krishnova. And the ability to take meaning and find this meaning and make it coherent made it end up in a way where when you have that coherence, you're able to then build memories on top of it again. You're able to build understanding on top of it again. You're able to start building all the pathways of a community again. Even if it feels like everything stopped and shattered and fell apart, it's the reassembling process means that something is actually always happening. And if you can find the meaning in that reassembling process, it will let you get back to a place where you can continue to grow as a community. So what does that mean? So this is where I took all these kinds of bits and pieces and went through that journey. So thinking of this collective ownership, for example, Krishnova was a wild character. She had 200% energy and 200% intensity with every single moment. Like if you've ever thought that I have like a large personality, I actually only, focus 10% of my personality on a person at any one time, because if I just went, it would be way too much. But Nova went 24/7. And so when she paid attention to you and made eye contact, you're getting that 200% energy with every fiber of your being. And she was so magnetic and electric that she could take an entire room full of people, and by the time she was done talking about anything, the whole room was focused on her. All the time, just constantly. She pulled people in, and she would move boulders. She would look at something, she'd go, I'm going to superhumanly just nudge this over. And then she'd go around and find about 10 people who really liked maintaining things, she really liked building stuff, she really liked whatever, and she'd move the boulder superhumanly and then hoodwink them into maintaining it. But it was one of those things where everybody liked it, because that's how you build communities, in a sense. She was a community builder. And one of the communities that she built was this little place on the internet called Hachyderm. And it was a Mastodon instance that was, queer hacking, elephant hacking, Hachyderm. It was a cute little tiny place on the internet with about a couple hundred people on it. And then I met her. We went bouldering because we both moved to Seattle the same weekend. Coincidentally, she moved from New York, I moved from Portland. We went bouldering, and I dislocated my shoulder. And as you do, and it turned out, I found out at that exact moment, I dislocated my shoulder at the top of the route, and I said, I do have hypermobility. Okay, good to know. And then I jumped down, held my shoulder, and I said, so not to be a spoil sport or anything, but I dislocated my shoulder. And you saw the brilliance of Nova in that moment, because she just sort of shifted like an entire person. She went, let me swap out the floppy disk. I'm now in incident response mode. Hi, how can you? And she was like, how would you like me to handle this? How would you list out the options? And I'm like, well, let's just go downstairs and figure out the next step. We went downstairs, and she, away from the people at the front desk. And she goes, well, I'm an alpinist, so I'm not new to this. And I said, I figured, because of who you are as a person. And she said, yeah, so you want me to teach you how to pop it back in? I'm like, yeah, let's do it. So that's what you do. You grab everything, you tighten your muscles, and then you bring your elbows down to your sides. And then she taught me how to pop my shoulder back in. And then so I popped it back in. And she said, how are you feeling? I'm like, oh, amazing. I'm not going into shock anymore. Give me like 5 minutes, I'll be perfectly great. Want to keep bouldering? And she said, hell yeah, let's do it. So we walked up. We talked about bouldering. We talked about her brand new job that she had just started, our plans to change the world, all the things we wanted to do to build communities, how can we make the world a better place, how are we going to break capitalism, fuck it all up and build something better. We talked about that for like an hour and a half. And at the end of it, she said, so I want to help you do whatever it is you want to do, because I like you, and I think you're great. And what is it that you want to do? And I'm like, overthrow capitalism. And help you build stuff. And she said, we'll start with that one. So then I started on Hachyderm. A couple weeks later, Elon Musk buys Twitter, which the entire world decided was a bad idea. And the tiny little Mastodon server went from 700 people to the next week, 5,000 people. To the next week, 25,000 people. To the next week, 55,000 people. And in the middle of this, it's Ruby on Rails running on an experimental server in her basement with a forked file system with weird hacking patches in it, a couple, experimental flights on here, random ass hardware from, a hacker space at some point, and she's going, yeah, this is now a production instance for tens of thousands of, maybe we should move it out of the basement. And I'm like, So we worked on moving it out of the basement. So that was the first time I met Noah. And that was the first big thing we did together. And we built this community. So not only did we move it out of the basement, we took a live production instance of Ruby on Rails with two broken hard drives that we didn't know were broken. That was fun to diagnose. The entire thing was falling over. All the systems were overcritical. We were running transatlantic NFS, NFS is bad. Transatlantic networked file systems are bad. Transatlantic network file systems with NFS with broken hard drives. Unadvisable. So we did that. And then we streamed it on Twitch because of course we did. So we did all the incident response on Twitch the entire time, working round the clock and absolutely kicking the ass out of most production team SLAs, response times, uptimes, and everything else, just casually in our spare time around our real jobs. Because of course it did. And the most important thing of the whole thing was the entire community. The entire community was behind us. They were talking about us, they were talking with us, they joined in Zoom. It was this happy hacking collective. Everybody was on board. We'd fire up a thing, we'd go, yeah, the servers are literally on fire. The CPU load is 1700%. I've never seen a number that high. Anyway, the server might be down for maintenance shortly. And people would go, yeah, this is fine. We believe you, we trust in you. So the reason we did this, the reason we did it that way, is because we were really, really struggling with how does this community that we've built, what does it mean for a community to truly own its own self? That was really the question that we were struggling with. That was the question that we were trying to answer. And when people ask me, well, why didn't you use Kubernetes? It's not like you didn't have most of the world's expertise on running Kubernetes doing Hachyderm. We didn't use Kubernetes at all. We used systemd, Arch Linux, and bash scripts. The reason for that was we wanted the complexity to be so low. We wanted the default. We wanted the how you do it to be what the official documentation roughly says, as close as possible. We want it to be something the community collectively can own. Whatever that meant, we didn't know, we were finding out. It turns out the community doesn't necessarily care about owning the thing. Don't really care about the thing. The community didn't necessarily want to own maintainership of the thing. The community wanted to own the community. So cool. What does it mean for a community to own a community? What does it mean for a community to be part of this thing that's larger than itself? Without being a cult following of a larger than life personality figure. We were all kind of here for the community, but also we were all kind of here because of Nova. And so when she died in a rock climbing accident, I was not involved in that one. When she died in a rock climbing accident, the community, rallied behind it. But in a sense, the identity had been lost. Because what is Nova's happy hacking community without Nova? And we had tried for a year and a half for it to not be Nova's happy hacking community. Nova stepped down from being the head moderator of Hachyderm. She stepped away from certain other things. She was like, yeah, I'm not actually running anymore. It's the community's thing. And then everybody's like, yeah, but you're in charge because you are awesome. And we're here kind of for you. And she said, well, you can be here with me, but it's that we spent a year and a half figuring out how to untangle that type of identity. Turns out, changing the identity of a collective, really, really hard. Even now, that she's been gone for almost 2 years, that identity is still tied in a way that's really difficult to extract. And one of the things that we ended up doing was we just changed how we thought about and connected with who she was and is as a person. So she's gone. We grieved. Things kind of shut down and fell apart for about a year. It was a whole thing. But as we rebuilt these connections, as we changed the shape of that connection, as we figured out how to tie things together, you can't take her energy away from the space. The energy is occupied in a different way. The energy is always going to be there, and it's okay that it's there. And instead, what you can do is you can build something new with it, and continue that energy and continue that legacy in a certain way. And so when Quintessence, Nova's life partner, and I started emerging from the hole of grief, and we started being able to do things again, she reached out to me and she asked me a very bittersweet question, which is, would I be the first fellow at the Nivenly Foundation? So originally, the Nivenly Foundation was a foundation that was founded by Krishnova. The reason she founded it was to help communities grow sustainably, learn how to do this cultural thing of becoming this cooperative, community collectively owned and built and grown thing without breaking apart due to communication problems, without breaking apart due to communication skills, without breaking apart due to getting a certain size of community and then going, wait, what do you mean people can sue me? And all of the really, really weird logistical problems of that. Like, one of those logistical problems was something that we didn't actually talk about at the time out of safety reasons. But it turns out that on Mastodon, because of where media is stored, how media is processed, and how that media can land on your server, you have very little control over that media, and if your signups are open, the threat model is infinite. And so it's basically trivial to A, put CCM on someone's server, and B, populate and spread that out and federate it to 98% of the network in about 10 minutes. Which means you need an LLC, or you need some sort of legal protection, because if that is identified on your server, even if you claim to not have intent to distribute it, you federated it to 200,000 servers in 10 minutes. That sounds like a new problem, says the law. So Nivenly Foundation was personally created as an LLC for that protection. But it was also created, how can we give these types of protections? How can we teach people, here's all the things that you need to know. People won't tell you until it's too late because it's a lot of information, but you really better get some of these right. And here's how to grow this. Here's how to get contributors. Here's how to not burn out. Here's how to heal from the burnout. Here's how to deal with grief and loss. And that last question is something that I've been spending about a year figuring out. How to deal with the grief and loss, how to grow a project, continue it, and have it take its shape that's going to be the new shape. How to do that, and I'm still kind of figuring it out, and I'll be figuring it out for the rest of my life. But when we worked on this, the original plan was for Nova to be the executive director, and when that was no longer a thing, when she didn't need to be anymore, she would step away from the executive director role when she had gotten initially started, and then she would be the first fellow. And the reason she would be the first fellow would be she would just use her magnetic energy to spread open source, fairy fluffy goodness throughout the world. And the reason Quintessence asked me to be the first fellow instead, besides the obvious one, was she and I are a lot alike. We are deeply, deeply similar, to the point that everyone who knew her very well has looked at me and gone, this is almost uncanny. I had that same kind of magnetic personality. I love to switch my voice register as a joke. So whole thing. We have this 200% energy, this way to pull a room together, and for some reason, people seem to think that I have good ideas and good thoughts, and they want to hear more from me. And I'm like, cool, I love to share. I just didn't expect everybody to be interested. And that's great, but how do I use that to make the world a better place? How do I use that to teach people how to build software, to build cultures, to build groups, to take this institutional knowledge of how do we own something and build something together? Because it's a skill set that our society has lost a bit. And we really, really need that. And especially now, as our cultures around us are crumbling, as our massive macro structures of society and civilization are changing in ways that uphold a very few and the expense of a great many. What does it mean to relearn and rebuild and re-understand how to be humans? Because humans are really, really good at this thing. We just need to remember how. Because we are collectively shaped by the cultures that we nourish. We are collectively shaped by the mended threads that connect us, and by the memories that we all share. So thank you.